As many of you may suspect, indeed know, the notion that we're facing a climate crisis is the scam of the past 35 years. The biggest scam that we've seen. COVID's giving it a run for its money, but COVID just recently came on the scene. Oftentimes, people will say, James, you do a great job debunking the global warming, climate crisis stuff, but how does somebody like me, how do we do this? And what I want to do is equip you so that you can do the same thing, so that you can show people who may have an interest in the topic but not much knowledge, you can show them why it is that we're not creating or facing any type of climate crisis. So that's what I intend to do today. 3 points I want to make. First of all, we all have the tools that we need to debunk climate alarmism. It's not just me, it's not just Mark Morano, it's not just some of the scientists, Willie Soon and others in this room. You can do this yourself. And that's very important because it allows each and every one of us to be disseminators of truth. It's not just that we can soak it in, but we can also spread the word, and I hope you'll do that. Second, I'll be presenting some key points to make. What are the components of a thorough beatdown of climate change alarmism? And a beatdown that is concise, that is easy to convey, and easy for people to understand. And then finally, how to obtain compelling facts and evidence so that you can make such an argument in such a case. Let's begin with the data that's most important, the points that are most important to make. If you only remember one thing about my presentation today, and when you are speaking with people about why there's not a climate crisis, if there's only one point that you can make to them, it's this. If you only have 30 seconds to say why you don't believe in a climate crisis, it's this. The fact is, temperatures are not unusually hot today. You cannot have a climate crisis based upon the notion of rapid, extreme global warming when temperatures are unusually cool, not unusually hot. This chart that you're looking at right here, this was published by the European Science Foundation, their Greenland Ice Core project. And this was published in the peer-reviewed journal Science. What you are looking at is scientists drilled into the Greenland ice sheet. By drilling down to the base of the ice sheet, pulling out an ice core, and then examining that ice core, they can reconstruct temperatures that have existed in years past. It is not a controversial method. This has been a technique that has been used by scientists for decades. And it's very important to look at the results of this. On the top left, you see temperatures over the past 100,000 years. I'll look to my left, on the audience your right. This chart here on the top left. Here's 100,000 years ago. This is the last glaciation when temperatures continued to fall and ice sheets continued to advance from the polar regions toward the lower latitudes around the world. Approximately 20,000 years ago, temperatures began rising. And approximately 10,000 years ago, we reached our current interglacial warm period. This is very important to look at the temperatures here in the past 10,000 years. And that has been expanded here on the top right. Here we see temperatures 10,000 years ago as they continued to emerge from the glaciation. Here are temperatures today. Notice a couple things about this. Here on the far right, this little line, this little small line that goes up at the end, that is the entirety of the warming of the past 150 years. When people say that we're in unprecedented temperature period, no, we are not. In fact, we'd have to keep warming at this pace literally for centuries to reach the temperatures that existed 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago. Another point that's very important, this is the period here when temperatures were so warm at the Holocene climate optimum, the maximum temperatures there, when human civilization first developed and flourished. The notion that with today's 21st century technologies, we cannot handle this little bit of warming at the far right is preposterous when we realize that for the vast majority of the time period that human civilization has existed, temperatures were significantly warmer than today, including the time period during which human civilization first developed and flourished. Here on the bottom chart, we see temperatures of the past 2,000 years. 1,000 years ago, we see temperatures during the medieval warm period. Again, temperatures that were warmer than today. Here's all of the warming of the past 150 years. One thing you might notice in news stories when they talk about the melting of snow and ice in Greenland, and sometimes they'll say, a new village has been discovered. Look, we're warming so much that we're uncovering villages we didn't used to know existed. Well, yeah, those villages thrived 1,000 years ago. They weren't on the cusp of being overrun by snow and ice back then. The reason why we're only uncovering them now is because, again, temperatures were much warmer 1,000 years ago. Temperatures thrived then. So condensing that down, back to the main point. If there's only one point that you remember from my talk, if there's only one point that you have a chance to convey to people who believe in a climate crisis, it's this. We can't have a global warming crisis when temperatures are unusually cool. And temperatures are unusually cool. The Earth does not have a fever. The Earth has a cold. It's bordering on pneumonia. Now, some of you may have seen in the media just over the past few days the reports that the Earth is experiencing its hottest temperatures ever. Reuters published an article, and the lead sentence, let's see if I can get this exactly right, was the Earth recorded its hottest ever temperature on whatever day. And then they said, the 3 days this week. Look at those precise words. The Earth recorded its hottest day ever. And it's not just Reuters, whether it's the Washington Post, New York Times, Time Magazine, others, the same thing. Hottest ever temperature recorded. Earth in uncharted temperatures. Now, this is the most deliberate and blatant lie and hoax that you will ever hear. If they know anything about what they're reporting on, they know that temperatures were much warmer for most of the past 6, 7, 8,000 years. But they parse their words. The Earth recorded highest ever charted temperatures. It used to be 5, 10 years ago when they would convey that garbage, you would see buried in paragraph 7 or 8 of the story, they'd note that, well, it's highest recorded by humans with modern temperature instruments, which have been in existence for, if you want to look at the satellites, for 40 years. If you want to look at mercury thermometers around the world, maybe 100 years. They used to put that in buried at the bottom. Now they don't even do that. If you call them on what they reported, they say, well, no, it is accurate because, well, it is the highest recorded temperature. And they word it, the Earth recorded its highest temperature, so people don't even think that it's what people have recorded just with recent modern instruments. It is a deliberate hoax. It is a deliberate lie. Call them out with this chart and the fact that temperatures are unusually cool, not warm. By the way, it's not just the European Science Foundation and that study and the peer-reviewed journal. These charts are the same thing. This was the very first United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. This chart was published here. I cut and pasted it from the report. You see the same thing. Here in the middle chart, you see temperatures of the past 10,000 years. Here's the warming to 10,000 years ago. Here's the Holocene climate maximum. The United Nations itself shows you this slight little increase in temperatures is nowhere near temperatures that have predominated throughout most of the entirety that human civilization has existed. It's the United Nations itself that is demonstrating that. By the way, on the bottom chart, this again, United Nations chart, notice something really important about the pattern of temperatures. Temperatures bottomed out in the 1600s or so. You had a step increase, and then the 1800s plateaued, and then in the 1900s you had an increase in temperatures again. Remember that, bottoming out in the 1600s, step increase, plateau, step increase. This is solar data going back to the 1600s, reported in the peer-reviewed journals, Geophysical Research Letters. By the way, challenge me if you ever see any chart or data I'm citing that is not official government data or peer-reviewed study, call me out on it. Geophysical Research Letters, what scientists did is they reconstructed solar activity going back to the 1600s. Look at this, and this is in different spectrums, they all show the same thing. In the 1600s, the sun's energy bottomed out, step increase, leveled out in the 1800s, step increase in 1900. Boy, does that look familiar? We know that the sun, as Dr. Sunis pointed out, as many others have, the sun has always been the primary driver of temperatures. It always has been, and it still is. Remember this, when you see temperatures rising this century, yeah, well, there's a reason why. And that reason's right here, the increase in solar output. By the way, temperatures are not rising nearly as fast as the United Nations has predicted in years past. On the left, I have a couple of quotes. In 1990, the very first United Nations climate report. They predicted 0.30 degrees Celsius of warming per decade from that time period, from 1990. Here's a quote. The average rate of increase of global mean temperature during the next century is estimated to be about 0.3 Celsius per decade. Well, what you see on the right, this temperature series, this is from Dr. Roy Spencer, who oversees NASA's satellite program that measures precisely global temperatures, NASA satellite instruments. The satellites have been measuring temperature since 1979. Yeah, there's been some increase in temperature, but the increase has been at a pace of only 0.13 degrees Celsius, not 0.30, 0.13 degrees Celsius per decade. Less than half what the United Nations predicted. And back then, when people like myself, like many of the scientists in this room, when we said, wait a second, 0.3 is way too warm. And among skeptics, predictions varied. Myself, I think I was probably mainstream among skeptics. I said probably about 0.1. That's what we can expect, based largely on solar activity. Some effective greenhouse gases, but not that much. All right, so 1990, 0.3 degrees Celsius was a prediction. Now on the bottom bullet point, in 2018, the United Nations had to correct itself. It was getting too embarrassing. So now in their 2018 report, estimated anthropogenic global warming is currently increasing at 0.2 degrees Celsius, likely between 0.1 and 0.3 per decade. Expect that to come down soon too, because 0.2 is soon going to be quite embarrassing to them as well. But the key point here is temperatures are not rising nearly as much as has been predicted. And this now, we've surpassed 30 years of data. It's not just some little blip. 30 years of data show that they have predicted more than twice as much warming as has occurred. Therefore, there's no reason to believe that their future predictions hold much validity either. This is a chart by my friend Dr. John Christie, who also works with NASA and their satellite program measuring temperatures. You see the solid red line, that's the average, and all the squiggle lines are the individual models. These are the computer model predictions that the United Nations relies upon when they tell us how much dreadful warming we're going to get in the future. Those models that they have modeled back from 1975 to the present. The solid red line is the average of the warming predictions. The green line, those are the actual temperature measurements, again coming in at about half of what was predicted. A prediction of future warming is not scientific proof, it's not even scientific evidence. It is a prediction. The computer models are only as good as what they are programmed to compute. And if you program them to expect a substantial amount of warming that is not justified by science, that's not proof, nor is it evidence. The real-world data trumps computer predictions every day of the week. And the real-world data shows we are not facing a climate crisis, either in the past 30 years, or today, or any time in the foreseeable future. This is a fantastic chart. This I cut and pasted directly from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's website. Again, everything I'm presenting is objective, it's validated, it's credible. In the media, you'll often hear stories, or see stories in the print media, about it could be apple farmers in Wisconsin that no longer can grow apples because it's too warm. It could be about fish species in Montana streams that they say are struggling because of all the warming that's occurring. And usually they'll say, oh, 10 or 20 years ago, we were able to do this, but now it's too darn warm. All right, this chart here, this is data from the United States Climate Reference Network. This back in 2004, and the end of 2004, the beginning of 2005, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, they emplaced a network of temperature stations, 100 and I believe it's 4, maybe 114, I think 114, around the country. And this is the best temperature network they have because they took them out of asphalt parking lots, they pulled them away from barbecue grills, they took them away from airport runways where they used to measure temperatures, getting a false warming signal. All of these are set up in pristine locations that are not corrupted by artificial heat signals. And what you see is temperatures going back, this is January 2005, every month logging temperatures throughout the country. Here they are today. There has been absolutely no warming in the United States for the past 18 years. None. Whenever you see an article in the news media that tries to, again, whether it's fish in Montana, bumblebees somewhere, whatever it may be, and saying global warming is to blame, no, it's not. If there truly is harm going on, and oftentimes there's not, it's some anecdotal story that is not the trend, but if it is, it's not global warming. It's certainly not if it's a United States story, because there has been no warming for at least the past 18 years, and again, who knows how much further back here before that network was in place. Don't believe the hype. Just because somebody complains because he's not a good farmer, that doesn't mean global warming is to blame, especially when temperatures haven't risen. Now, a number of individual so-called crises. These are the ones that you hear the most about. So I want to equip you with the knowledge that you can refute people when they say, for example, in August, oh my goodness, a hurricane might form in the Gulf of Mexico. Like as if that never happened before coal-fired power plants and SUVs. Look, still don't believe in global warming? Well, before you can attribute any storm or any worsening of storms to climate change, you have to look at the data. We have data that tells us. If there is a trend of worsening either in frequency or severity, extreme weather events, then you have a point. But fortunately, we have objective, credible data. Here, this is Dr. Ryan Maui. He is a hurricane scientist. He has worked with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He has taken data going back to 1980. What you see on the top is the number of hurricanes each year throughout the world. Here we are today, here we are in 1980. You don't see any trend whatsoever, except perhaps a lessening trend. The number of hurricanes that are forming is going down, not up, as temperatures warm. And this data goes back more than 40 years. The bottom number is major hurricanes. There you see no trend at all. What's interesting is, in the media, this is the latest messaging from climate alarmists. Because major hurricanes are staying about the same, overall hurricanes are becoming less frequent. Now they say, the percentage of hurricanes that are major hurricanes is growing. There's now a larger percentage of hurricanes that are likely to become major hurricanes. As if there's this big increase in major hurricanes. No, what it means is we're not getting as many small hurricanes, which should be good news. But again, they deceive, they misinform, and they lie when they can. Here's the actual data. You don't see any worsening of hurricanes. By the way, some people, when I used to present this data, said, well, it's only 1980. That's 40-some years. That's not long enough for us to know. Well, fortunately, these charts here were presented in the peer-reviewed journal Nature. This was published a year ago, June of 2022. Scientists went back and reconstructed records of hurricanes going back to the year 1850. This is globally in northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere tropical storms. What you see, going back to the year 1850, this is the number of hurricanes that existed. This is where the last chart that I showed you begins. So what we know is that actually this chart showing no increase in hurricanes is actually the best possible starting point for people who believe in a climate crisis, because it shows essentially no trend, where we know in the long term there's been a significant decrease in hurricanes as temperatures have warmed. Again, that's the peer-reviewed science journal Nature. Here are a couple quotes from that paper. Quote, we show robust declining trends in the annual number of tropical cyclones at global and regional scales during the 20th century. The declining trends found are consistent with the 20th century weakening of the Hadley and Walker circulations, which make conditions for tropical cyclone formation less favorable. We can get into in more detail why you have a decline, a weakening of the Hadley and Walker circulations and how that relates to climate change, but it is not a coincidence. All right, moving on, tornadoes. I went to high school in Sioux City, Iowa. I was back speaking in South Dakota a couple weeks ago. And there were tornadoes spawned in the area while I was there. And again, we get the notion that somehow global warming is the cause of this. This chart is cut and pasted from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's own website. And what it shows is F3 or stronger tornadoes, the ones that destroy buildings and kill people. They're also the ones that are most accurately measured. They're easiest to measure. This is their own chart, their own data going back to 1970. You see on the left how frequently we had F3 or stronger tornadoes, and then you see the trend over recent decades. As the planet has warmed, tornadoes have become less frequent and less severe, not worse. Drought. Anytime there's a drought somewhere, keep in mind the Earth is a huge place. We have a dynamic climate. We have dynamic weather patterns. There will always be drought somewhere. There always will, always has been, always will. Whenever there's a drought somewhere, especially if it's someplace where people live in California. There's a lot of people living in California who like to play on this issue. It makes the news. All right, so what we have here, this is a chart cut and pasted directly from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's own website, official government data. This line, the green bars that go up, that shows the percentage of the country that NOAA defines as experiencing very wet conditions. The yellow bars going down, that shows the percentage of the country that NOAA defines as having very dry conditions. If, by the way, because of the lighting, you don't see the chart extremely well, my slides are in the handout, and you can also get a copy of them in full color on the link provided on the bottom of the speaker page, or you can email me, jtaylor@heartland.org. Look me up. I'll send you copies of these slides. Okay, here's the most important part. NOAA has been tracking the percentage of the country very wet or very dry month by month going back to 1895. What you see as far as very wet, you don't see much of a change at all. It's pretty much static. I mean, individual ups and downs, but no trend. But the percentage of the country experiencing very dry conditions is quite significant. So here we have this line here. That's when 20% of the country is experiencing very dry conditions. Bars that go down here show 40% of the country experiencing very dry conditions, 60%. Notice that up until about 1960 or so, it was a frequent and regular event that more than the country, that 40% or more of the country was experiencing very dry conditions. It happened about twice a decade, sometimes even more than that. Now, after about the mid-1970s, so really for the period of about the last 50 years, we are experiencing, far and away, the longest period ever recorded, I'll use their own terms, ever recorded, in which not 40% or more of the country is experiencing very dry conditions. When there is a drought in the southwestern United States, as there has been recently, and they say global warming's to blame, it's climate change. No. If climate change is to blame, if it's global warming, then we should see this throughout the country. Again, the earth is a large place. There always will be drought some places. But what we know for a fact, according to the federal government's own data, is that as temperatures have warmed, there has been a substantial decrease in the amount of the country experiencing very dry conditions. Drought is becoming less frequent and less severe objectively and undeniably as temperatures warm. A couple other points or illustrations of that point. On the right, you see a chart. This is cut and pasted from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. There you see their logo. This is their own website, their own chart. And what it shows is going back from 1895 until today, they show changes in precipitation. Every now and then you see a little dot that's yellow or orange. That's where NOAA has measured a decrease in precipitation since 1895. Where you see the grayish white, that's where they see no change. Where you see all of this area of green, that's where they've documented an increase in precipitation. The notion that we are experiencing more drought and less precipitation because of climate change is busted by NOAA itself. Even the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you see on the left, I cut and pasted some text from their report. The IPCC reports they have high confidence that mid-latitude areas in the northern hemisphere, that would include the United States, have experienced an increase in precipitation. And for other portions of the world, they have low confidence of any trends one way or the other. So basically, for the most of the world, they're not able to detect any trends except for really the latitudes where most of the world's population live. They see an increase in precipitation. And we see that by particular instances, nationwide instances. In 2017, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration reported, and this is reported by USA Today, drought in the U.S. fell to a record low this week, with just 6.1% of the country experiencing drought. That was an all-time record for the smallest percentage of the country experiencing drought as measured by NOAA officially. And then that record was broken just 2 years later. In 2019, NOAA measured only 2.3% of the country experiencing drought. When you hear about a drought in California or in Arizona or wherever else, realize that is the exception to the rule. And throughout the country and throughout the world, drought is not becoming more frequent and severe. It's becoming less frequent and severe. And as one might expect as a result of that, there's been a decline in wildfires. Yes, again, the earth is a large place with a dynamic climate. And there will be wildfires in places. On the right, you see, this is cut and pasted, this chart from NASA's own website. What NASA did is they have satellites that have been in place since 1998, precisely measuring the percentage of the world's landmass that is experiencing wildfires. And what they report is that from 1998, the percentage of land has decreased by 24%. In this chart, where you see red and orange, that's where there's been an increase in wildfires. The areas where you see blue has been a decrease in wildfires. The rest of the world, not much of a change. Objectively, undeniably, wildfires are becoming less frequent and severe as the earth warms. Now, when I began presenting this, again, sometimes people would say, well, that's only since 1998. How do we know that's just kind of a recent uptick? Well, according to a study in the peer-reviewed science journal, Journal of Geophysical Research, scientists went back to the year 1901, more than 100 years of data. And what they found is that there has been, quote, a notable declining rate of burned area globally. This trend of declining wildfires has been going on for more than a century, which coincides with the period of modest warming that we've experienced. As temperatures warm, The most likely reason is you get more precipitation from the oceans, from bodies of water. Those clouds carry over to land masses. You get more precipitation, as we showed. More precipitation is making it less amenable for wildfires. There's also been a substantial greening of the earth, measured very precisely by scientists. This chart on the right, again, it is cut and pasted directly from NASA's own website. This is their chart. What they did is they measured the density of foliage, of vegetation throughout the world. Where you see red and orange, that's where there's been a decrease in the density of foliage. Where you see shades of green, that's where there's been an increase. According to NASA, quote, from a quarter to half of Earth's vegetated lands has shown significant greening over the last 35 years, largely due to rising levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide. That is their own conclusion. They also state the greening, the net greening, when you add up the total amount of land with increased vegetation, subtract the amount of land with decreased vegetation, those that show nothing don't affect the equation. The net greening represents an increase in leaves on plants and trees equivalent in area to 2 times the continental United States. You don't hear about this in the media when they talk about the effects of global warming. The effects of more atmospheric carbon dioxide, warmer temperatures, is that we have become more of a paradise for life on Earth. You don't hear about that. And that also correlates, and not just correlates, but is a significant factor in increasing global crop production worldwide. Now, there are many reasons why crop production is increasing, advances in technologies, fertilizers, but also we have a climate where we have more atmospheric carbon dioxide, which has the same greening effect it does on vegetation across the board, longer growing seasons, fewer frost events. When you hear in the media that global warming, climate change is already causing crop failure, this chart here, this is cut and pasted directly from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization's website. This shows cereal crop production. These are the big 3 primarily: corn, wheat, rice, globally. Here we are 10 years ago, here we are today. The increase has been greater than 10%. You see an increase almost every year. By the way, just this week, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization put out their forecast for 2023, and they expect yet another record. How can you argue that climate change is causing crop failure when what we see is an increase with records being set almost every year? And it's not just global as a net with a lot of variance. Almost every country in the world shows the same pattern where you have records being set on a near yearly basis. Moving on, for this conference in particular, I think it's quite noteworthy for the Doctors for Disaster Preparedness. Oftentimes we hear about if there's a heat wave in Europe somewhere, and they say, well, 300 and something people died because of the heat wave. And here we have global warming that's literally killing people. Our emissions, our greed, our selfishness is literally killing people. All right, well, this data charted here is from The Lancet. The Lancet is probably the most prestigious peer-reviewed medical science journal in the world. Scientists went back and they looked at mortality, deaths around the world. And what they found was that a little more than 7%, I think the exact number was 7.78%, of deaths around the world could be attributed to temperatures that were not optimal, harmful temperatures. People hear that and they say, see, look at that. Almost 8% of the deaths because of climate. But here's the important part, what you don't hear in the media, is that the vast majority of deaths that are resulting from temperatures that are not optimal are deaths caused by cold, not heat. What you see in this chart shows, and this is about a dozen or so countries, but this is the findings for the global situation. What you see in the medium blue on the far left for each country, those are deaths caused by extreme cold. Light blue, these are deaths caused by moderate cold, pervasive moderate cold. Pink, deaths caused by pervasive moderate heat. Red, extreme heat. What these scientists reported in this prestigious peer-reviewed medical journal is that 19 times more people, indeed 20 times more people, die because of cold temperatures than hot temperatures. Yes, when there's a heat wave, yes, some people may die, but as the earth warms, the greatest impact is to reduce this. The number of people, the substantial number of people dying because of pervasive, moderate cold. Recent global warming is saving millions of lives. And if temperatures continue to warm, again, you knock down this. This is a far greater factor for death, cold temperatures and warm temperatures. Before concluding on the individual arguments, I just want to highlight, this is one of my favorites. There are more that I can bring up in Q&A, but in the media a couple of years ago, Beto O'Rourke was making a point as he was running for governor of Texas, I think it was, maybe the Senate, I think it was governor, that, well, the reason why we have all these refugees, it's not because, well, they just want to come here and get something, it's because it's our fault. Because of us and our carbon dioxide emissions, they can't farm anymore. They can't grow any food. It's leave or die. How can we blame them? And the media picked up on that. So here we have, this is a screenshot from the UK Guardian. The title is "The Unseen Driver Behind the Migrant Caravan, Climate Change." And here is the lead sentence. While violence and poverty have been cited as the reason for the exodus, experts say the big picture is that changing climate is forcing farmers off their land, and it's likely to get worse. Here's another story. This is NBC News. The title is "Central America's Choice, Pray for Rain or Migrate." Ravaged by drought, farmers in rural Honduras and Guatemala live on the edge of hunger. It's our fault because of climate change. And here they're pointing out particularly Honduras and Guatemala because those were the countries that were sending the most people to our southern borders and across our southern borders. All right, this was a big talking point. I would hear this from people every time I'd give a talk. Well, but what about the climate changes forcing these people here? Well, guess what? Okay, the theory is because of us and climate change, you can't grow crops in Honduras and Guatemala anymore. That's why they're coming. Well, guess what? Just like the data I've showed you before, we have actual objective data from credible sources on crop production, not just around the world, but in Honduras and Guatemala. So when I saw this, I took a look. I kind of suspected what the answer might be. Here we have, this is the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. They're going back to 1961. This is for Honduras, one of the two nations cited in the NBC News report. This is crop production, the big three, cereal crops again. This is the staple crops that people live on. Here's production in 1961. Here's production today. It's more than doubled. You see records set almost every year. Long-term, mid-term, and short-term increase in crop production. Records being set almost every year. By the way, that goes to 2017. This particular website with this really friendly visual graphic doesn't produce anymore. So by about 2019, people say, what's it been doing since? Okay, well, here's not quite as visually friendly, but this is the same United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization data. Now it's updated through 2021. And again, you see the increase in, again, even more records set since then. During the exact time period, the media is telling us because of climate change and drought, they can't grow food in Honduras. Here's Guatemala, the same thing. Long-term, mid-term, short-term increase in crop production. And here you go over the past 6-7 years. It's not because of climate change. It's not because of us. It's because of poverty. It's because of violence. It's because of government corruption. It's because of government systems that don't have the respect for individual rights that we have in this country. That's why people flee Guatemala and Honduras. And when we go out and blame climate change, not only is it inaccurate, but it is making it worse for people there because it tells people not to go and pressure the government, to put pressure on the crime organizations. It says, no, none of that exists. It's climate change. It's only going to get worse. You are doing a disservice to these people when you go out and blame climate change. By the way, it's not just Honduras and Guatemala. Here's the United Nations data for Costa Rica and Ecuador and Nicaragua and Panama and Mexico, everywhere throughout Central America and indeed throughout the world, it is an increase, a substantial increase in crop production as the planet warms. Climate change is not sending refugees to the United States. If anything, it's lessening the flow because under a warming world, you're more able to grow crops in these countries and perhaps withstand the oppression of corrupt governments and a violent culture. Again, here we have the global trend. I want to point out a couple other things. The United Nations back in 1990, 30 plus years ago, in their first assessment report, here's a quote, patterns of agricultural trade could be altered by decreased cereal production in some of the currently high production areas. Well, for 30 years, we've seen that has not been the case. You think they might apologize and change tune? No, back in 2015, much more recently, climate-related impacts are already reducing crop yields in some parts of the world. Well, I guess technically it's right, Probably in places like Afghanistan where there's war and you can't grow crops, you might find that. In a couple places where there is war ravaging the countryside, but in almost every country in the world you see an increase in crop production. They've measured it and they've shown it themselves, and still they lie and put out these press releases so that people will think climate change is causing a reduction in crops and we're getting more starvation because of us. Don't believe the statements from government bureaucrats or even scientists themselves who have a dog in the fight. Believe the data. Everything I've shown you here is actual data from credible sources. It's available. I'm going to show you how to get that data yourself if you want to back it up. By the way, here's crop production in the United States. I'm going to skip over this because I want to save some time, but in short, we've heard about the Texas heat wave last week. Just as a year or two ago, we heard about the Texas cold snap. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has their own data. And what they show is that there's been no increase in extreme cold temperatures in Texas. When they blamed that on global warming, that was a lie by NOAA's own data. And there's been no increase in heat waves in Texas. If anything, there's been a decrease in very hot days. This is NOAA's own chart. When you hear otherwise, it is either a deliberate lie or an ignorant lie. I'm not sure which is worse, but when you hear someone say it, when you hear a media source say it, they don't know what they're talking about, or they're deliberately deceiving you. All right, how do you get this information? If you don't want to, everything I showed you, if you know where to Google search, you can Google search NOAA very wet dry, and you'll get the chart I showed you that shows the 40% of the country experiencing very dry conditions. If you Google search USCRN, you could get the temperature, the Climate Reference Network temperatures going back from 2005. But if you don't know how to Google search it or where to find the charts, here are some resources for you. First of all, Climate at a Glance. This is a book for those of you that were at the Heartland Institute's climate conference back in February in Orlando. I held this up. I'm going to hold this up right now. This is Climate at a Glance for teachers and students. Facts for climate realists on 30 prominent climate topics. Hurricanes, tornadoes, drought. Much of what I showed you here, they're in this book. So I just randomly opened up. These are 2-page summaries. You get a few bullet points. If you or someone you're showing it to only has 30 seconds, you can look at the bullet point and know what is the key issue, what are the key facts. Underneath the bullet points, we have a concise short summary, and we link to the objective peer-reviewed studies or data so that you know it's valid. And then we have a visual graphic, so at a quick glance, you'll have a memorable visual to remember it by. This book is available, Amazon.com, it's $10. Online, it's free if you want a digital copy. I always like having a copy in hand. By the way, if you forget where to find it or forget what the title of the book is, email me. I'll make sure that you know how to get it. You can go online, climateataglance.com, and we have electronically presentations much like I showed you for each of these topics. When someone says, oh, still don't believe in global warming because of that hurricane in the Gulf, you can show them the chart that I showed you. Here's a screenshot of our webpage that I took earlier this week. As you can see, climateataglance.com, the first 3 showing there, Climate at a Glance, climate refugees. Then Climate at a Glance, islands and sea level rise. Climate at a Glance, malaria and mosquito-borne diseases. That's where you get your 2-page summaries. They're concise enough that a Little League parent sitting in the stands with you can understand when you show it to them. Next up, climaterealism.com. This is another website put on by my group, the Heartland Institute. Every day, our staff, Anthony Watts, Sterling Burnett, Linnea Lukin, myself when I have time, we do a Google News search. Google News is not just Google search, but it's the news of the day, what's trending. And we type in climate change. And we see what the climate establishment is pushing as this day's climate scare of the day. And we go out in real time and we debunk it with a short article that says, much like what I've done today, here's what they claim, here are the facts. Boom, here's a screenshot of it. climaterealism.com. When you see something trending in the news that day, go to there and you can find the facts. And here is, I took a Google News screenshot. This is like what we would do. The middle one, probably we'll have a hard time seeing it from there, but it says, Michigan, a climate laggard, plans to catch up fast. And the claim is that climate change is causing crop failures in Michigan. And it's similar to what the Biden administration asserted just a couple years ago. This is a climate realism article that I wrote. The title is Biden Ad Claims Michigan Crop Crisis as Michigan Crops Set New Records. The Biden administration put out an ad in Michigan prior to the midterms claiming that because of climate change, farmers in Michigan, and especially cherry farmers, all farmers, but especially cherry farmers, can't make a living anymore because of climate change. That's why we need to do something. I looked at the data. I wrote this article. We put it on climaterealism.com. Here's the data I charted. This is cherry production across the United States. We don't have production specific to Michigan, but Michigan comprises the largest share of this cherry crop production. What you see is going back from 1994 until today. This is United Nations Official Food and Agriculture Organization data. You see a substantial increase in cherry production. And of course, I already showed you crop production across the United States. We debunk it in real time. ClimateRealism.com, there's where you go. Also, what's up with that? I mentioned meteorologist Anthony Rotz, who's a senior fellow at the Heartland Institute. His What's Up With That.com website is the most viewed climate website in the world. There's a reason for that. Every day he publishes articles, again, that you'll want to know to keep current of the real state of climate science and climate change. CFAC.org, we had Paul Dreesen speak earlier. You have Mark Morano speaking later. If there's anyone else here, I apologize for not mentioning you by name. Every day they put fantastic articles giving you the truth about climate change. ClimateDepot.com, Mark Morano, who'll be speaking later. Every day he updates with this, with links to the stories you need to know. Go there for good information as well. Between those sources, you have information, all the information you could ever want. And if there's something else that pops up that you don't find, email me. I'll have my staff send you links to information or the data itself. So, in conclusion, we all have the tools we need to debunk climate alarmism. The key points to make I've showed you. Every single asserted climate crisis they make as a proof is false. And most importantly, we cannot have a climate crisis based on global warming when temperatures are unusually cool. Remember, we can't have a global warming crisis when the Earth has a cold, which it does. And now you know where to find the compelling facts and evidence. One final note. It can be discouraging sometimes. I feel it sometimes. The one-sided coverage in the media. The knowledge and reality that in the schools, they're indoctrinating our children to believe in a climate crisis. I've had people sometimes say, James, I agree with you, but I give up. We're fighting a losing battle. What's the point? No, we're not. The American people are smarter than you think. The American people can discern truth, and they get it when they're being fooled. They get it when someone's trying to swindle them. I believe it was 2 months ago, might have been last month, but I think it was 2 months ago. The Associated Press, in coordination with the University of Chicago, they polled Americans throughout the country. This is incredible, something you need to remember when you get discouraged. The key question was, what do you believe is the primary cause of recent warming? Now, I think the key question in debate isn't really even what's the cause, but are we facing a crisis? It doesn't matter who causes it if we're not facing a crisis. But still, when they ask the question, what is the major component? Only 49% of the American public said humans. Less than half said we're causing increased temperatures. If you don't believe in that, you don't believe in a climate crisis. So don't give up. With information like this, now you have the knowledge of specifically why what you know has been true. Now you know exactly why, the knowledge you can go to and you can share it with your friends and neighbors. Truth will win out. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions, time permitting. Thank you.
Now that is accommodation, yes. Great talk, James. Hey, I've got a question for you. Some of the temperature data charts you showed, you indicated that they had been corrected and taken out the stations that were impacted by the recent urbanization or whatever.
Right.
In the general temperature record that you often see in the press, that is still the general data, and have they properly corrected for urban heat island? I suspect not.
Right, great question. What's interesting is I showed you the NOAA temperature stations, now the USCRN, Climate Reference Network. It's been in place since 2005. When you see press statements, press releases from NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they still will report the corrupted stations. They have the best data. They thought that these stations would show, oh, those pesky skeptic deniers, this will show that it's not because of urban heat island influences. Now we can show even in the sites that they said we should put up that we're getting the same warming, but we're not. We see no increase in temperatures under those stations. That's deliberate that they don't report the CRN data in a prominent manner. By the way, we at the Heartland Institute, we have a project that we have just started. We talked about it at our climate conference in Orlando in February. Meteorologist Anthony Watts is overseeing this product. We are setting up temperature stations with the best instruments, superior even to the ones used by the federal government. We have triple measurements. We have triple temperature readers at each station to make sure that one of them doesn't go askew, as sometimes happens. And we're citing them according to the best practices, away from streets, buildings, etc. We just put up our first one in Nevada. We tested it over the past month or two. It's doing great. Now we're putting up 10 Soon after that, we're going to put up 20, 30. We're going to try to get over 100 in the country and then set them up around the world because we don't have good temperature networks around the world. Even the corrupted NOAA temperature networks here in the United States are better than around the world. So anyway, yeah, the answer is the data's there. NOAA doesn't want you to know it. And so we're going to make sure not only that their pristine network gets attention, but we're going to put up another one just to show that, again, situated correctly, we're not getting the warming that they claim.
Thanks. And there is one small exposure in your presentation.
Okay.
On one of your slides, you are clearly cherry picking your data. So.
Which is that? Oh, you got me there, Joseph. By the way, that's the most frequent criticism I get.
I'm good.
When I engage in a formal debate or an informal discussion with somebody who's an advocate of the climate change alarmist theory, and I say, show me what's wrong. And they can't show anything that's wrong, so they say, well, you're cherry picking. What, I'm cherry picking the entire world for wildfires? I'm cherry picking the entire country for drought? Come on, but, you know. Yes, hello.
Hi, hello. I'm Linda Sweeney. I was going to say that I'm presuming that all of this data, NOAA, and this is data that we're getting from our own organizations, our own government organizations, paid for by taxpayers. This is neutral data, right?
Right.
All of this. How is it then that, how can Congress, the Biden administration, and everybody completely ignore the data given to them by our own organizations that we pay for? I mean, the cognitive dissonance, it's hard to even, I don't get it. I mean, they're just completely disregarding it.
Yeah, great question.
So why doesn't NOAA say anything? Why doesn't anybody
Two primary
do anything?
reasons why you don't have the Biden administration or others that'll say, oh, wow. First of all, is when NOAA or NASA, when they put out their press releases and statements, they don't show that. They'll put out statements saying that hurricanes are getting worse. I'll give a talk sometimes, and then I'll hear afterwards someone will go on their cell phone and then in Q&A, well, James, you said that hurricanes are not getting worse, and you said that that's data. It says right here on NOAA's webpage that hurricanes are getting worse. So, well, who do you trust? The bureaucrat scientists whose jobs and salaries would go away if the climate crisis goes away, their statements, or the data? Yeah, but their own organization says. No, so Joe Biden and others, they don't get presented with this data. They get this spin from the bureaucrats, or if there are non-government scientists who have a stake in this, they get the spin, not the data. That's one of the reasons. Second reason, some of them will actually have this data, but they have a dog in the fight. They have an ideological agenda. They have a policy agenda. So it's willful ignorance.
You would think there would be some whistleblowers at these organizations that would do something. They're just sitting there getting paid,
How have
presenting the
whistleblowers
data.
fared in the past month or two?
That's true. Well, maybe there's a cry out for somebody to present the data.
Right. So and
that
that's
they've spent their lives gathering.
and
it's
that's
just
how we can make a
disregarded.
difference. Because the more people in this room, if people are watching on a live stream or on video, the more you share with your friends. If you're sitting in the stands, Climate at a Glance for Teachers and Students, the 2 pages.
Yeah.
My thought process for this was because I used to coach my daughter's Little League baseball team.
Mm-hmm.
I used to listen to parents in the stands and little things that pop up in the news. They're not always focused on the game. Well, what about, I sit in my cigar lounge. Well, James, still don't believe in climate change? This information, the information that Mark's going to provide, information that Willie provided, just share it with your friends and neighbors. And we see in the polling, despite the one-sided media coverage, despite the one-sided education, the American people are intelligent. We'll win out. Science will win out.
We hope. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah.
Just quickly, actually relevant to the question right before, I think what's happening, to be optimistic, the same reasons people are not hearing the truth about climate change is people are not hearing the truth about COVID and that entire scam that happened over the past 3 years. And all the data that's very obvious about how dangerous the vaccines are and so forth, it's the same kind of pattern. But the good part is that having treated COVID and having learned how to manage all these things, I have a associate, a physician, who before was very much a supporter of the vaccines and the whole COVID lockdowns, who then learned, because of the reality, that this was all not so and that the government was lying to us. Well, now she's more willing to listen to me about climate change because she's learned the government lies to you. So I think this is happening across. And people, this is an important point, that they've learned through COVID, and it's so obvious to people how wrong they were on that now we can speak about this also.
Great point. Isn't that awesome? I remember the first few months of the COVID hysteria where we would see in the media, oh, well, this is going to be the climate deniers' comeuppance. It's the same people who are challenging the masks and the shutdowns that are climate deniers, and this will be their death knell because now people will see them for what they are. It's been exactly the opposite. Instead, now people, RFK Jr., ask Mark Morano about RFK Jr. He'll wax poetic for hours. RFK Jr., who was one of the leading criticizers, calling for climate deniers to be thrown in jail and prison, now comes out and says, wow, COVID's opened my eyes. I wish I hadn't said some of the things I'd said in the past. Go figure. Yes?
Thank you, James. I'm kind of a numbers guy at some times, and you mentioned that a little over 100 of the official weather stations were actually according to the standards. And remind us of what Anthony Watts found when he did the survey, and how many weather stations did not meet the Weather Department's own requirements for how their weather stations are to be built and sited, et cetera. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for that question. So back a little over a decade ago, Anthony Watts researched and published his Surface Stations project. What he did is he and volunteers went out to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's official temperature stations, where they gather the data from which we get the so-called official temperature record. NOAA has standards on how these stations should be situated. They should be away from any types of urban development, away from asphalt parking lots, away from buildings. They have a set standard for the number of feet between the temperature station and any of that. They should be devoid of trees that could shade or unshade the stations. And they grade them on a scale from 1 to 5 for how much they comply with how the station should be situated. I forget the exact number in his first report. It was much less than 10%. I believe it was less than 5% of the stations complied with how the station should be. And what he found was that for stations that were compliant with how they should be situated, they showed approximately half the warming, I believe it was, than the stations that were corrupted. And it showed, here you have very strong evidence that the official climate record is corrupted and showing twice as much warming as is really happening. That's what's being reported. This past year, we at the Heartland Institute, we gave Anthony the go-ahead and the resources to follow up with another survey. And what he found, even though that first survey received so much attention in the media, including some of the mainstream media, NOAA has done little to nothing to correct the situation. According to the most recent survey, 96% of NOAA's official temperature stations are corrupted and heat biased. And what they show is that the corruption amounts to, on average, those corrupted stations show 0.6 degrees Celsius more warming than the stations that are not corrupted. By the way, that 0.6 degrees Celsius of warming is at least half of the warming, the entirety of warming that's been asserted since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So we're not getting nearly as much warming as you see in the media reports, and again, you see it in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's own best data, which they don't report. All right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.